There's a kid I know, and she keeps getting told the same thing. You're too much, you're impulsive, why can't you just be normal? And she does the thing that kids often do. She decides she's the problem. So she built her whole self around managing that problem, so nobody sees it. I know that kid pretty well because I am that kid. And I found out a long time later that almost everything I'd been told about myself was not quite right. Hey, I'm Dr. Regina, Ph.D., and Divergent Paths is the podcast for late diagnosed neurodivergent adults, where we talk about all the many things we've experienced, ways to work with your brain to make your life a little easier. I also write a weekly newsletter, Nerd Notes, where I deep dive into the topics discussed on the podcast. The link to sign up is in the show description. So here's what nobody told me when I was a kid. Science shows impulsivity in relationships is often pro-social. I know. You want to know what pro-social means. Don't worry. I got you. Pro-social is a behavior that is oriented to others, not to yourself, but outside yourself, toward your connection, toward cooperation, to closing the distance between you and other people in your relationships and in your community. It's not being nice, and it's not martyrdom or selflessness in the saintly sense. It's when your decisions are oriented toward the bond, toward maintaining connection. This matters because pro-social behavior is the machinery of belonging. It's what allows you to stay part of a community. And it's how we signal that you're safe, you're with the people you're with, that you're one of the village. We're wired for this because this sense of belonging used to be about survival. Getting kicked out of the village was a real threat to your physical safety. The reflex to accommodate in terms of connection is the reflex to stay alive. Spoiler alert, our nervous systems still think belonging is imperative to survival. This is hardwired in human nature. The part of this that flips the story the child in the opening was told is we often assume when you're impulsive, the choice you're making is selfish. You're being impulsive because you want to serve yourself, and that making a choice that serves other people takes willpower and is the better moral choice. But a study, not a recent study, but a study a while ago in 2013 in Psychological Science, found the opposite of this is true. People with lower self-control are more willing to sacrifice themselves for the people close to them. And who has lower self-control than people who are neurodivergent? It's literally in the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, and I'm pretty sure for autism, although I'm not sure about that part. So in close relationships, that fast automatic reflex is already primed to be pro-social. It's already primed to put the relationship and the bond as the priority. Exerting self-control is a slower system. It means taking a moment to think about what your capacity is and to see whether or not that sacrifice serves you. Sit with that for a minute. Your impulse is to reach toward other people for that belonging. This isn't a flaw. This is just how survival happened or happens. We talk a lot about masking. I talk a lot about masking and how masking helped us learn to protect ourselves when we didn't know we were neurodivergent. If you're masking and you're impulsive, and your impulsive tendencies are toward protecting the connection you have with people in your life, masking, impulsivity is positive, making the choice between the connection. This is why the mask was never inauthentic. It was based in that impulsivity, and that impulsivity was you wanting to maintain the connection. A lot of times we hear masking as performance, as lying, as manipulation. But if masking is pro-social, because our impulsive tendencies are to protect the connection, that proves that this isn't a deception, that the masking wasn't there to deceive the other person necessarily. It's the same pro-social accommodation and that same instinct that everybody's running on. It's just turned up in intensity because of the late diagnosed neurodivergence. You weren't trying to trick anyone. You were trying to maintain a bond that you felt was imperative to your survival. If you were shamed for being impulsive, for making impulsive choices, the research shows that your impulse was likely a positive one, that even if you were impulsive, you were likely impulsive in service of your connections and your relationships. The very trait that gets pathologized as self-centered at its root is aimed at connection and maintaining a bond to someone else in your life. Everything that you were told was proof you didn't care was actually you caring too much, putting too much in too fast. The science shows neither of those things to be true. And this isn't me just trying to reframe this as something positive when it's something that we've all experienced. There's real scientific evidence underneath this. One of my favorite examples of this is that impulse that you have when you're talking to someone and they are telling you a story that is really important to them, and you maybe interrupt them, or maybe they finish their story, and then instead of you responding to their story, you jump in with, "Oh my God, this happened to me too," and you tell a story of your own. It was a long, long time before I learned first that some people interpret that as being self-centered. It was a long time before I realized that people interpret that as selfish, as you turning the conversation to yourself. And I became very self-conscious about it because it was a very natural way for me to communicate. And I never intended it to take the focus off the other person. I always intended it as a means of connection. So when I learned that people could interpret it that way, I became very self-conscious about not sharing that way and being very careful to allow someone else to finish their story, to make sure that I commented, to make sure it felt reciprocal instead of me just jumping and sharing because I got excited. And when I get excited, I will run forward with things sometimes and forget. As I started unmasking, I've learned a bit of balance around this, right? We're talking about intentional masking and being mindful about when you mask, but I'm also mindful about just not jumping into some of those pro-social impulses that resonate so deeply with me and feel so affirming to me, so that I make sure that the other person is there with me. And with my close friends and with the people I'm very intimate with emotionally, they do the same thing. We do it to each other all the time. And it's just not something that we question because everybody does the same thing. But being able to take that step back and think before you jump over into sharing your experiences versus figuring out what the goal for the other person in the conversation is. If they're wanting validation, can you help give them validation in a way that isn't just you saying, "Oh my God, that happened to me too." So this is one of the ways to name what's happening and do your best not to judge yourself for it, right? When I talk about how I felt as a child, there was definitely a lot of shame in that impulsivity and that jump into wanting connection in a way that was not necessarily received that way. Name it, identify it, say, hey, this is what happened, and recognize that you're reaching for belonging with that. It's not a weakness, and it's not something that you need to completely dismiss or take out of your means of communication and connection with people. It is something that can very much bring you closer to people. Another thing to do is to take a moment and just take a quick breath before you respond, and then take just that moment to give yourself a little bit of a gap to slow your system down so you can weigh your needs in a situation. If you're being asked to do something you're not sure you have the capacity for, taking that breath, taking that moment to weigh what your needs are too is really important. And you don't have to change your answer. If your impulse was to say yes to something and you take a moment and breathe and think through, do I have the ability to do this? Then that yes is the way to go. But sometimes you do need to recognize too that you need to say no in those moments, and you need to protect yourself as well as protecting the bond. Because the truth is, when you do that in equal measures, you protect the bond better than always saying yes and making things good for the other person. One way to approach this, if you're working on something like this or you want to work and think through this, is think about some old memories. Think about times past. Think about moments that maybe still come up in terms of rumination, where you think about, oh my God, I wish I would have done that differently. Maybe something that you had some shame, or you were told you were too much or selfish or fake. Try to look at that through this lens. Try to look at it through, were you self-sacrificing to protect the connection with somebody? Is that what you were reaching for, versus you just being selfish for the sake of being selfish? So remember, as I've said before, the mask was never a lie. The impulse to mask, to protect, to self-sacrifice, to people please, to save the connection. There's nothing wrong with any of that. It does have a cumulative effect where it does hurt you over time. The impulse to reach, to connect, to want to find that belonging isn't wrong, right? You just need to make sure that you take your needs into consideration as you're working toward that belonging as well. And now you have some scientific evidence to back yourself up, to recognize what some of the impulses were for you and why. You were reaching for that connection because it was so important to you. So do you want to hear about some of the ways neurodivergent folks are pro-social? Book a Make It Make Sense call with me and let's talk about it. The link is in the show notes. And until next time, remember, belonging is imperative to your survival. It always has been, and it always will be.